G'day guys, and welcome back to the latest tutorial from Just the Basics. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at how to create this medieval / more intricate architectural environment that you see now. We're going to focus mainly on creating the arch windows and the archways themselves and how to add some intricate looking geometry, some interesting stylization to them, but we will also touch on the basics of modeling, texturing, and of course lighting. So if any of those topics interest you, make sure to stick around. This will be a relatively beginner tutorial, but we will be trying to move as quick as possible throughout it, just so you have a bit of a relative idea of what you can expect. Let's dive straight in and begin. To start, let's make sure we're using the most current version of Blender, which as of recording this video is Blender version 3.6.2. We're going to jump into the render properties and change a couple of settings straight up. I'm going to switch the render engine from Eevee to cycles and set the render device from CPU to GPU. Underneath the output properties, I'm just going to select render region. That way when we're in our camera view, it won't render anything besides what our camera or final scene will look like. That's just going to help lighten the load on our PC, or in my case, my laptop a little bit. And finally, underneath our world properties, we're going to set the color to a sky texture. And that's going to use the Nishida sky texture to provide lighting for our scene, which is really awesome, if you ask me. The next thing we're going to need to do is we're going to go ahead and delete our default light. Then, selecting our default cube, we're going to tab into edit mode, hit GZ1, enter, and then tab out of edit mode. And what we've done now is we've just lifted that cube so it's now resting nicely on this invisible grid line for our scene. I'm going to then go ahead and hit S5 enter to scale that up 5 times larger than what it was initially. And then I'm going to hit SY5 enter to scale it 5 times longer than what it was initially. And finally, I'm going to hit H to hide that because we're not going to use it right now. What we will do with it still selected is underneath our object settings, we're going to rename it to hallway. We'll be doing this for all our objects, that way we don't get confused between them and it's easy to navigate and understand which one is which later on. Next, let's go ahead and hit 7 on our number pad. Now if you don't have a number pad on your computer, you can go to Edit, Preferences, and then underneath Input, just click and select Emulate Number Pad, and then you can use the number keys as part of your normal keyboard. So after having pressed 7 to enter top-down view, let's go ahead and hit Shift-A, add in a mesh, and we're going to add in a circle. Underneath the add circle box, we're going to enlarge that and change the vertex count from 32 to 64 to give us a bit more geometry to work with. And then with our circle selected, we'll tab into edit mode and left click and drag to just select all the bottom half of those vertices. I'm going to hit delete and delete vertices, and then holding shift, I'm just going to select these bottom 2 remaining vertices. I'll hit EY to extrude them down on the Y axis. And then next what I'm going to do is select only one and extrude it along the X axis by hitting E and then X. Then I'll go ahead, selecting the other one on the adjacent side, hit EX once more, and also extrude that out. And as you can probably tell, I've extruded these to this rather almost thicker grid line, just sort of making a bit of an idea of this shape for this archway that we're creating. So now I'll hold shift and left click those 2 adjacent vertices we've created, and hit E, Y to extrude them once more, this time towards the top of our archway. Again, in line with this thicker grid line. Now to bridge the gap between these 2 vertices and fill in the edge, we're going to hit the F key, which stands for fill. We'll then hit A to select all, and F once more to fill that face in. Now you can see we've got a nice archway shape, but we need to give it some depth. To do that, let's hit E, make sure it's already locked to the Z axis, which is the blue axis, and then hit 0.5, enter. Now we can hit A to select all, RX90 enter to rotate it on the X axis 90 degrees so it'll be standing upright. And then all I'm going to do is hit G and Z to drag it up until it's roughly resting on the floor of this grid. It doesn't have to be perfect, close enough is often good enough when it comes to visual effects. And then let's hit 7 and then G, Y to once again center it into the middle of its origin point. Now, while we're still in edit mode, what I'm going to do is switch from vertices select to edge select mode. And pressing the Alt key, I'm going to left click and select one of the edges, which will then, when Alt is held down, enable all the edges to be selected, which we don't want. We only want to select our actual archway itself. It's far easier to hit Alt, left click and select, and then deselect the edges that we don't want, which is just these 5. Now I can hit Control B to bevel this edge and if I scroll while doing that, I can increase the bevel segments to add some smoothness to that bevel. I'm just going to left click to confirm this selection for now, and you'll see it's brought up my bevel options. Now here we can change the width if we feel we weren't quite happy with what we beveled out. We can also increase the segments, which I might change them up to 16. And then under profile type is the most interesting options. I'm just going to turn off my overlay so you can see what's going to happen here when I set it to custom. It completely removes our nice smooth bevel transition, but instead we have this curve graph that we can edit ourselves to add in all kinds of interesting architecture or geometry to this archway. Or if you're like me and just looking for a simple solution, we can select a preset, and I'm going to select cornice molding. I really like the look of this, and I think it's perfect for what I'm going for. But of course, you can choose whichever preset suits your scene best. I'll just re-enable my overlays, and now I'm going to go over to the adjacent side, holding Alt and left click. I'm going to select all of the edges on this face, then pressing Shift once more. Just deselect the edges I don't want to affect, which is those 5 again, and hitting Control B, it's going to remember my bevel options. So all I need to do now is bevel it to the width that I want, and left click to confirm selection, and that looks really good. I'll tab out of edit mode, right click, shade smooth, and underneath modifiers, I'm going to enable the most classic modifier, the edge split modifier, probably the first modifier I ever used in Blender, and that will give it a nice sharp contrast on those smooth edges. And there we have our archway. So let's go ahead into our object settings and rename this from circle to archway, enter to confirm. And we're just going to hit H on this to hide this as well. And the last thing we're going to create just for the moment is our arch window stencil. What I mean by that, and you'll see in this tutorial in a moment, is we're going to create a cookie cutter essentially that we can use to cut out the hole or archway for our windows. To do that, it's extremely simple and just follows the process we just went through. So you'll be able to remember most of these steps, no doubt. We're going to hit Shift A, add in a circle once more. Our vertices is already set to 64 from our last circle we added. Let's go ahead, tab into edit mode. We'll need to make sure we're back in vertices select because you should probably still be in edge select like I was. Then we can just select the bottom half of those vertices, delete them again, and holding Shift, select the bottom 2 remaining vertices, extrude them down on the Y-axis, and then hit F this time to fill in the gap. Then I'm going to hit A to select all, F to fill in those vertices with a face, and then finally E, 0.5 to extrude that. I'm going to tab out of edit mode and right click, shade smooth, go to my add modifiers and add in a edge split. And there we have our stencil. I might actually tab back into edit mode, just hit A to select all, and also rotate this 90 degrees until it's standing up, right? And then once again, move it till it's sitting on the grid floor, and then switching to top-down view by pressing 7, just hit GY, and just center it with its origin point a bit more. Now that we've done that, we can tab out of edit mode, give it a new name. I'm going to call it Window Stencil. You can call it whatever you like. Enter to confirm, and let's go ahead and hit H to hide that. Now let's begin to assemble this scene, this environment, and this is the really cool part because it all comes together really nicely. The first thing we're going to enable again is our hallway. So just click this little eye selection to re-enable the view of that. And then with our hallway enabled, I'm going to tab into edit mode, enable face select, and just left click on this face, and then left click on the adjacent in face, and delete both faces. So now we have our corridor hallway. I'm going to go ahead and turn on my archway. And with that selected, I'm going to scale it up until it fills the hallway. The fact that both of these are square, they should fill it up quite nicely. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit G, Y, and drag it all the way down to the end of the hallway, just so that we can go ahead and array it throughout. What do I mean by that? Let's go to this little modifiers properties again. I'm going to add another modifier, also in the generate column. We're going to select array. What that does, if you're not familiar with it, is it allows us to array or duplicate an object as many times as we like. Currently, it's arraying it along the red axis, the X axis. Let's set that value to 0, and instead we want to array it along the Y axis. I found typically a value of about 10, or in this case, -10 to send it back the opposite way, works quite well, because I want to array it about roughly 5 times. So I'm going to turn that count from 2 up to 5. And you can see here, it almost perfectly fits in. Well, perfect's a bit of a stretch, but let's just hit GY and move that along a little bit just to center it more. Now, if I were to switch to rendered view, you could see that our scene's already begun to take a bit of shape. Things are looking kind of cool. It's all sort of happening. Perhaps our archway could be scaled up a little bit, just so there's no gaps in the ceiling. That looks pretty good. Now, let's go ahead and switch back to solid view and add in our arch windows. I'm going to re-enable that stencil that we made. And what I need to do is go ahead and rotate this on the Z axis 90 degrees by hitting RZ90, then enter. And I'm just going to move that along until I can center it roughly where I want my window to be. To move it around, I'm just hitting the G, Y, or X key, and then left clicking to confirm that selection. So right then I just hit G and Z, and now G, Y, and left click. And I think that almost looks pretty good, maybe a little bit more centered. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a add-on that isn't the most popular in Blender, mostly because it doesn't create the best geometry when it's finished or applied. But for the environment we're creating now, if this is just something you want to use as a background scene for a film, like what I'm planning on doing, I think it's more than sufficient. It works well, and if you don't notice it, you can render it easily enough on my laptop. I think it's fine. Of course, I'll probably start some kind of war in the comments, so I apologize in advance. If you know a better technique that you prefer to use, please feel free to let me know. I'll be happy to try it out. So what we need to do to use this method, this infamous method, is with our hallway selected once more, that is the box, I'm just going to tab into edit mode, A to select all, then E to extrude it. And I'm just going to scale that out a little bit, just until it's got a bit of thickness, because the modifier we're going to use only works if it has depth or density to the mesh it's applied to. Now I can tab back out of edit mode, and with our hallway still selected, we're going to add a modifier, select the Boolean modifier, and then here underneath object, we're going to select a little eyedropper and select our window stencil. Now, if we click on that, we can see nothing's changed, but if we go ahead and select that stencil and hit H to hide it, you'll notice we have the cutout of our window. And if we go to render view, you can see it's everything we want it to do. Perfect. But to add a little bit more detail, maybe we could go ahead and make a window sill. How are we going to do that? Let's re-enable our window stencil and just Shift D, duplicate it. I'm going to call this window sill. I'm not sure if that's how you spell it, but this isn't an English lesson. This is a 3D animation tutorial. We don't need grammar, but maybe grandpa. Okay, now let's go ahead and hide our window stencil. And what we have remaining is our window sill. I'm going to tab into edit mode. And for this, I'm going to select just this face and delete it. And also the outer face and delete that, until all we have left remaining is the edge of our window stencil. I'll hit A to select all, then E, and then S. And I'm just going to extrude that to once again give it a bit of depth. And maybe just hit G and Z to even out the extrusion of it, if that's a word. Now looking at that, that looks pretty good for what I want. I might hit S and Z just to even it out a little bit more. But that's basically all I need to do now. So if we look at that, we've got a nice looking windowsill. But why don't we go ahead and give it a little bit more intricate geometry? So in edit mode, let's select edge select, and then holding Alt once again, I'm just going to select that inner edge and then hit Control B, and we can see straight away it's applying that bevel profile. And I'll just left click to confirm, tab out of edit mode, and that looks really nice. I can move that out a little bit more just till it's only just sitting in the window, or whatever you think would look best for your scene. If we switch back to rendered mode, we can see this looks really nice. Our scene as a whole is looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and do one final thing with these arch windows. And to do that, I'll just enable our window stencil once more. We're going to go ahead and array them similar to how we arrayed our archways, just so we can have these windows between every archway. So once again, you probably guessed we're going to go to the modifiers, add in an array modifier, And what we're going to do is set the factor up to something a bit higher. Let's try 10. That's a bit too much. So let's pull that back a bit, and I'm going to turn the count up to 5. And I'm just going to go into this scene just till I can get a bit of an idea for what distance I need. So maybe something about 6.3. Looks like it's relatively centered. We've got one window too many, so I'm going to turn that count back down to 4. Now what I can do is just disable the window stencil by hitting H. And also I'm going to make sure to disable in renders, because otherwise we're going to see it in our final render, and we don't really want that because it'll block all the light coming through that window. Now let's go ahead and do the same for our windowsill. Add a modifier, array modifier, change the count up to 6.3 and the number from 2 to 4, left clicking to confirm all of that. And that's looking good. We can see that we've got our arch windows between every archway. So all we need to do now is add these arch windows in on the other side. So to do that, let's go ahead and re-enable our window stencil. And with our window stencil enabled, let's just duplicate that by hitting Shift D, dragging across on the X-axis until it's extruding, or rather protruding, through the hallway. And then with our hallway selected, we're going to add in another Boolean modifier. Once again, we're going to select our window stencil. This time it's 0.01. And we can turn that off in the viewport as well on both sides, making sure both of them are set to be invisible in our render as well. To get our windowsill across, all we need to do is hit Shift D, duplicate that, and move it along on the X, and just set it up right where we're happy with in the window until it's only extruding as much as we want it to. And we can go ahead, tab into edit mode. Once again, Alt left click to select that inner edge, and Control B just to give it that beveled profile on the opposing side. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead. I might just pull this across a little bit more. All that we need to do now is start adding some textures and finish setting up our lighting. I'm going to be using textures from polyhaven.com, which is a completely free resource. It's super awesome and so helpful. I actually have their asset browser add-on, which I'm not sponsored by them, but by all means, if you felt like you wanted to support them for the great work they do, you can go ahead and purchase it on the Blender market, or you can sign up for their Patreon and get it as one of the perks there. Obviously, if you don't want to spend any money on animation like myself, you don't need to use it. You can just download the assets that you would like and import them into Blender. But for the sake of time in this tutorial, I'm just going to be using their asset browser to add in the materials I want. So let's go ahead and switch to material view. And then once we're in material view, I'm going to split my view and by clicking in the top left-hand corner and dragging across, and then setting this view from 3D viewport to asset browser. Now here, I'm going to set it to Polyhaven, and underneath textures, I'm going to pull in a few textures that I think will work well for this scene. Let's go ahead and look for something like floor tiles. I think that will look pretty good. But if I just click and drag that onto my mesh, well then it would apply it to everything, the walls and the floor and the ceiling. And I don't really want that. I want a different texture for the floors. So I'm going to tab into edit mode, set my select mode to face select, and just select this floor. Under material properties, I'm going to name this first one to castle walls, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit plus, and with this floor selected, I'm going to select that material I've just added and select assign. Now if I drag this floor tiles on, you can see it's only applied it to the floor. I can rename that to just floor, but I'll go into the top left hand corner, split this view one more time, and set the bottom view to UV editor so I can adjust the texture or how it is projected onto my mesh. I'll hit U over here and cube projection. Now I'm going to hit A to select this projection. If I hit G, I can grab it around, and I'm going to hit SY5 to scale it up to the same dimensions as our actual mesh. In fact, I could probably make that a little bit bigger. Once again, just scaling that until I'm happy. And now let's go ahead and add in a different material for the walls. Maybe let's try these floor tiles. I'm going to hit A to select all of my mesh, and then just shift to deselect the floor that I've already projected. And let's hit U, cube projection, and then ASX5, enter to confirm that. And now if I switch to render view, we can see how this is all looking. So far it's looking pretty good, except for the roof. The roof is looking a little bit stretched. That's because it wasn't quite projected the right way. So just selecting that roof, I'm going to rotate that by hitting R90 enter over the UV projection. And then I'm going to hit SY.2, then SX5 enter. So now if we look at that, that should all be projecting the right way. All that's left to do is apply that floor tile effect to our archway. Once again, we're going to go tab into edit mode, A to select all, U, Q projection, and then we can just A over here in our UV projection and scale it up. What I can do now is find maybe just something like a concrete texture for my arch windows. I think this beige wall effect will look nice. And I'm going to apply that on here. Similar thing, tab into edit mode, A to select all, U, Q projection, and then do the same for the adjacent side. Tab into edit mode, A to select all, U for unwrap, Q projection, and if we head back to our camera view, it's actually looking really good. Now you might be noticing something quite funky happening with these walls here, and if I go to my render properties and just enable denoising, it'll be a bit easier to see that the wall's sort of distorting a little bit. The reason for this is because all of these textures that I've applied, and if you're using the asset browser, you've applied the same ones, they have displacement maps built in, which is awesome. But what that means in this case is it's storing the mesh where there's a high level of detail or geometry, such as around our windows. We don't want that. So let's go ahead and switch our UV editor to our shader editor. And with our different textures selected, such as our wall texture, we can just scroll in and unplug the displacement node. And now the walls won't be distorting in some kind of strange ways. All that's left to do is set up our camera, ready to render it out. So if I hit 0 to go to my camera view, you can see it's only rendering inside the camera, which is what I want. If I hit N, then select view, unlock camera to view, N to remove that. Now I can move my camera around wherever I would like. And what I might do is select my camera by clicking this box, and underneath my camera focal length, change it from 50 to 24. That way I can make this appear like a nice big scene. And I'm going to go to my world properties and rotate the sun until it's sort of shining through one of these windows here. And that's basically all there is to it, to creating the intricate archway and arch window texture here in this environment. Of course, there's so much more you can do, even just with Polyhaven's asset browser. Something I like to do is they've just added in some really cool castle doors. So if you search castle, you can see they've added in these really awesome large castle doors. If we go down to the other end of our scene, we could drag and drop them in, or you could just import them if you downloaded them from the website and use them to fill up the background scene or the final corridor here. I think that's a really cool way to give a bit of an ending to this environment. So then if we go back to our camera view, we can see down the end, we've got some doors. Something I like to do underneath my render properties is underneath film, enable transparent. That way, when you render it out, you have a transparent background behind your castle window. So you can add in a video, film, some medieval landscapes if you like. We could even go ahead and duplicate these doors, just grab them up a little bit. And that could be a really cool scene in itself. And of course, there's lots of other great assets on Polyhaven that you could bring in, like this vase and things like that, that you can use to sort of fill out the scene quite nicely and to give it a nice level of believability. Essentially, that's the basics of creating this castle corridor with arch windows and archways. I hope you learned something from this. I found it really fun to be able to create this, and hopefully soon I'll get to show you the finished scene that I use these for. If you have any comments, any questions, any tutorial requests, please make sure to mention them below. Thanks so much for watching. Until the next video, this has been just the basics of creating a medieval hallway inside of Blender.